we're going to go ahead and get started. So first, a brief introduction on Mode and the company. So we have two presenters here, myself as a host and Benn Stancil. Today, we'll be talking about what are skills that are super important for analysts to have and why you might be hiring for the wrong skills. But before we get started into that, we just wanted to provide a little bit of a level set for new individuals who may be a little bit, who may not be as familiar with Mode. So let's take about 2 minutes to really get into what Mode is, and then we'll get into the presentation. So we describe Mode as analytics, rather interactive data science meets modern BI. And the important thing for us is that we are used by a variety of organizations all over the world. And give me one quick sec. I have to modify my screen here. And one of the benefits that these organizations, these highly disruptive organizations have is the ability to be very flexible, the ability to work very closely with their teams and to really tighten that gap in between the analytics side as well as the business users. And that's something that we are very, very, very happy to provide, that analytics service for these highly disruptive organizations. And why do they work with us? They work with us primarily because research isn't linear. You start with a question and it seems like it's the answer. But over time you realize, hey, I have another question. I may need to ask another question and another question. And it keeps on going until you eventually work your way to the correct answer. And that is something that Mode realized and that we really have formed our entire product around. And second, analysts can't do their work in a single tool. Now, this, as far as the presentation, is probably the most important slide. Now, why is it the most important slide? It's because the amount of skills that you have to have as an analyst, as a data scientist, as a team lead, it is absolutely staggering. You have to have experience in SQL. I myself, in my younger years, was trained as a data scientist, and SQL takes a little bit to learn. You can figure it out in just a few weeks, right? You can do your select star and then go from there, but group buys take a while, order buys take a while. And all of those are extremely important skills and knowledges to have when you are beginning your career. Next, of course, the all-important Excel. Everyone I know uses Excel, and they were using it when I was a child, and they'll be using Excel probably until I die, right? So you have to have that skill as an analyst, and also Jupyter. So you have to have some aspect of Python and or R. I was trained on R myself, and that's where I cut my teeth. And then going forward to that, you also have to be able to manage GitHub repositories and other data repositories and other code repositories. And it's this collection of skills that makes it quite challenging for one, analysts to get started, and two, for the people who are hiring analysts to really understand what ideas and what skills are necessary to build their team. And with that, we'll stop the presentation. And I'll also now introduce Benn Stancil. And he is our Chief Analytics Officer here at Mode. And first, thank you very much. So we'll give a round of applause for Ben. And as well, he is a co-founder of Mode Analytics. So thank you very much. Ben, how are you doing this morning?
Good, thanks. Thanks for the introduction, James, and happy to be here.
Great. So I have a couple of questions. And now that we have this chart up, I just wanted to get your response on this collection of skills. So one, let's just start with the basic. Let's just say I'm a young analyst. How important is it to have this collection of skills in the ready? Are there some that are more helpful than others, for example?
So ultimately, I think these skills are important, and they're important things that you learn kind of down the road. For a sort of a young analyst trying to get started in the field, a lot of ways that I see these skills being important is it's the way that people hire. that there's often sort of gated on these skills that if you're trying to apply, for instance, for an analytics job at a bigger tech company or a bigger company that sort of gets a lot of resumes and things like that, there's often some like automated processes that will filter those things out. There's people who are sort of looking for keywords on resumes. These skills are the types of things that will often be looked for in those screens. They're easy, they're sort of technical things. They're easy to like identify in one line. They're easy to test for. But, and I think this is something we obviously can talk a lot more about, they aren't the skills that really drive, the job that you do day in and day out. That it's important to know how to write SQL. It's important to be able to work in Excel. Sometimes it's important to go do stuff in Python. But those aren't the skills that really make a great analyst or make an analyst really impactful in their business. Often those skills actually get back to the slide that was prior to this, which is this, like, how do you do this kind of nonlinear research, this investigative work, the kinds of things we are given nebulous questions, and you have to figure out what it is that you do to answer those questions. The skills on this slide are sort of things that you might have in your toolkit to help you address those questions, but that's not the primary skill that you actually need. It's actually this kind of curiosity around trying to understand questions, figuring out, like, being able to see things in data, like what are the patterns that look weird, what are the patterns that look normal. There's a lot of kind of deductive reasoning that goes into it that often I think is the thing that really separates what makes a really good analyst from somebody who's sort of just applying the tools to problems in more mechanical ways. So it's a little bit of a complicated answer with the way the industry is today, that I think these skills are important because they're the entryway into a lot of jobs, but they aren't the things that you actually would be doing for the most part on the job. That they're things that are valuable in sort of the sense that they enable you to use some certain tools that companies may be using, but they won't be the things that make you a great analyst or the things that really make you really impactful in your business.
Excellent. And actually, I'm going to go into that. How do you teach curiosity?
So I think that
hire or teach for curiosity.
So I think you can do both. I think that there was a really great blog post by somebody named Bobby Pierno about curiosity, and actually exactly this they just published recently about sort of training yourself to be curious. And I think that my philosophy on that is you basically have to give yourself places to practice, and you have to try it out and see what it feels like to look at a problem, to start to poke through it and be like, I'm curious about what's happening in this particular way or this particular way. And I think that the easiest thing that you can do if you're an analyst who's just trying to get started, sort of learning some of these skills, and this also applies to technical stuff as well, is find a problem that you're genuinely interested in understanding. So for instance, I'm a sports fan. There are lots of questions that I've had about sports and data that I really want to understand. That there was one more recently that I wrote a thing about that was, suppose it's a tie game in a basketball game, and your team has played really well. Like, it's given that the game is tied and your team has played really well. Is that good or bad? Is essentially the regression to the mean more powerful, or is the momentum of having played really well in the first half more powerful to predict whether or not you're going to win in the second half if the game is tied? To answer that question, you have to do a bunch of different data work. You have to do a bunch of analysis to figure out, okay, what are the results in these games? What are various confounding variables, that kind of stuff. The thing that pushed me through that question, the thing that made me keep asking the additional questions and to stay curious about those answers, was that I cared about the problem that was underneath it. I really actually wanted to understand what it is I was looking at. I wasn't doing it for the sake of solving something I didn't care about. I wasn't doing it because it was a toy problem in the back of a textbook. I was doing it because I wanted to know what the answer was at the end of the road. And so that sort of thing, I think, trains you to start seeing things that you wouldn't necessarily see if it was a toy problem where the answer was just in the back of the book and you're trying to get somewhere so that it matches what the actual, the answer key is, and then you can move on. Because then you're not sort of trying to like mimic curiosity. You're actually allowing the curiosity to drive you forward to answer those questions. And so there's a couple other aspects of that, of like doing stuff that you're interested in, that I think can be really beneficial. One, it pushes you to learn tools for the sake of actually solving the problem. So if you want to be able to learn Python, there are lots of tutorials out there that you can go through that'll teach you, okay, this is what this function does. This is what this function does. You don't really retain that unless you're trying to learn it to apply it to something. And so by having this problem that I wanted to answer, I could actually apply using Python as a tool, not using Python as an end in itself. The other thing I think that's really valuable about this too, and this is another place that I think is often kind of missed, is when you're working on something that you understand, when you're doing it right or wrong. If I had looked at this problem about this basketball thing and found out that 95% of the time it's better to have played really well than poorly, that probably is too high. Like I would have some intuition that, you know what, there's no way that it was actually that frequent or that strong of a result. This doesn't seem like it's that clean of a thing. I need to go back and kind of double check my work, make sure I did things right. If I don't have any context of that domain, if basketball is something I know absolutely nothing about, I may see that result and be like, yep, sure, seems good, why not, and move on. And so you provide this kind of check to yourself when you actually understand the domain that lets you be able to kind of, again, dig at the problems that you want to dig into, learn the tools, and be able to kind of figure out, hey, are you doing this right or are you not? There's some help that you get along the way just by understanding the problem.
So a brief thing on that. So just to wrap up, so not wrap up, to summarize. So basically work on something that you're passionate about, right? So to identify what you're passionate about, I myself, I'm a big video game nerd. Yourself, basketball. So how would you go about getting that information as something you're passionate about? Like what is that, Craggle, I believe, or some other thing?
Yeah, so there are two ways you can do this, I think. One is, if there's questions you're interested in, there's a lot of data out there. Sometimes it's like various public data sets and kind of public data repositories. Sometimes it's stuff that you have to kind of collect on your own. I, for instance, this was a while back, wanted to look up, this is back to kind of the sports thing. Where do football players actually come from? Like where are football players in college actually growing up? Like does the University of Alabama's football players primarily come from the South? And does, Ohio State come from Ohio and things like that? In order to get that data, like ESPN, for instance, has just tables of college football players in their hometown. You might just have to copy and paste it manually and do some like kind of messy data cleaning around that on your own. That's okay. Like sometimes you have to actually create your own data sets. Sometimes you'll find example data sets online. Some of it just comes from trying to think about, hey, I have a question. What are the different ways I could potentially answer it in the different data sets that might point me in the right direction? Like you're not going to always find something perfectly clean. You're not going to find, for instance, in this basketball thing, I'm not going to find exactly the data that I need, but you can often find something that serves as a proxy, which I think could also train you to work in a way that's actually going to be the way it will be in a job. That if, for instance, you're answering a business question that is, what is the effect of this new product on these types of users? You may not have data that measures that directly. You may not be able to say, all right, how much did this billboard on the highway actually drive more leads? You're going to have to figure out some sort of proxy for that as well. And so doing analysis on these topics you're passionate about can teach you also some of those limitations of there's never going to be a clean data set that you're just given by your professor to say, hey, here it is, go analyze it. You're going to have to kind of come up with ways to do that yourself, which may be sourcing from existing data. It may be kind of generating your own data. It may be finding data sets that aren't a perfect match, but you can still infer some things from.
So you don't necessarily have to go to Kaggle, right? You can go to ESPN. You can do your own stuff.
Yeah, there's data everywhere. And another, this is a little bit of a tangent, but in the process of doing all of this stuff and trying to figure out some of these things for questions like this I wanted to answer, there are also other skills that you start to learn to be able to enable it. So there's places you can scrape data from websites. You can learn a little bit of Python to actually scrape that data, learning a little bit of like how you can use something like Beautiful Soup, which is a Python library for scraping data. It's not necessarily a direct skill that you will see in sort of this is the libraries you have to learn for data analysis, but by using it for this practical purpose, you're actually sort of pushing yourself forward to learn the tool again in a way that is useful for the problem you want to solve, rather than trying to check off, okay, I now know how to use matplotlib or pandas or whatever.
And I had to put myself in the going back 10 years, right? I was a young guy, graduating school, and I had an interest in marketing analytics. That's kind of how I got my start. I had no idea how to scrape a data set. I had no idea how to, that data munging was like going to be 90% of your time. That was intimidating to me, very intimidating, right? What would you say to people just getting started who encounter this hurdle, right? Who encounter this, okay, how am I going to learn this whole set of skills so that I can be attractive to an employer?
So there's the optimistic answer and the kind of cynical answer. The optimistic answer is that you don't actually need those skills to be attractive to an employer. Like that you are already an analyst in a lot of ways. there's a book called Everybody Lies, which was by a data scientist, or he was a data scientist who I think worked at Google in kind of an academic relationship. And it was about the trends of what was happening and like basically what we as people reveal about ourselves about what we search. Most of it was we're all terrible. We say nice things, and in reality, when we think nobody's looking by Googling things, we expose ourselves as being monsters. At the beginning of this, though, he was talking about basically having a conversation with his grandmother, where his grandmother was telling him who he should be dating. And he was like, this person was great, and she was like this, you should date her, people like this, you should find more people like this. The point he was making was his grandmother, who didn't know how to use Excel or didn't know how to, certainly use Python or things like that, was an analyst. She was an analyst by observing the things that were happening with like his previous relationships, by trying to draw conclusions about them, and by making some sort of recommendation about, here's the person that you should be dating because of that. I think y'all will be a good match because of these things. And so to me, like the optimistic answer to your question is everybody's already an analyst. We already do all of this. We already look at data around us. We don't necessarily think of it that way, but we already are trying to make decisions and trying to learn from these observations that we have in ways that is very much mirroring what analysts do. And so to be an analyst, all you have to do is kind of apply that thinking that most people are already pretty good at and already kind of fluent in, to business problems that may be a little unfamiliar, or to other questions that aren't necessarily as familiar. And so it's more about learning that domain, the domain being marketing, like demand gen type of stuff, as opposed to your grandson's dating habits, but it's learning that domain. And that's really the thing that you need to do. And that's a very like accessible thing. It shouldn't be that scary. The kind of cynical answer to that is, again, there is like a pattern in the industry to emphasize some of these skills. I think that is starting to go away a little bit. And I think that you can break through in that by showing some of the things that you have done that are analytically sound, even if they aren't so like technically impressive. That if you have a blog, for instance, that's just talking about, hey, here's some of the things, the questions I asked, here's a thing that I tried to figure out, here's how I did it. I did it all in Excel. I did it all with data that I copy and pasted from Wikipedia. I downloaded it from various places that just allow you to down CSVs. All that stuff to me is still very impressive, and actually probably a better indicator for teams to see that than it is to see a resume that has a bunch of languages listed on it, but no sort of demonstrated aptitude and trying to do analysis, trying to solve problems, pushing yourself to be curious, all those sorts of things. So to me, it's more about demonstrating that you're interested in these problems, that you're willing to push, that you've tried to answer them, and kind of you're passionate about that part of the job, not just like, okay, how much, there are no sort of, it's not to pass a coding test. There are some jobs that will give you coding tests. I disagree with that. We at Mode, for instance, when we hire data folks, don't give people coding tests. We ask them these kind of ambiguous questions, see how they address them, and assume that people can learn the technical skills, that if you come in and you're really good at thinking about these problems, we'll teach you SQL. People can learn that. I think the reason a lot of people don't is exactly what you described, if it seems intimidating, but it shouldn't be. It's just a tool. It's something, if you can learn Excel, if you can learn how to use basically any sort of technology these days, you can learn how to write SQL as well.
So two things I took from that. One, grandmothers definitely know best on who you should date. So I'm a big believer in that. She saved me from quite a few miserable situations. But two, the importance of qualitative research methods in hiring. So a little bit of background about myself. Actually, I have a pretty strong history in qualitative research methods, and I found it to be particularly helpful, especially when starting out. And you were speaking about the importance of those. So one, how important is it? And then two, how do you actually go about to acquire those skills if you haven't if you haven't had a master's of sociology, for example?
So I don't think you necessarily need formal qualitative research skills. It can be helpful. It can be helpful to understand roughly like scientific method type of things. In some jobs, you're applying that directly if you're doing a lot of like A/B testing and that sort of things. In other cases, you're more looking for like sound analytical thinking. So, the kind of obvious examples of this are are you able to identify when you have sort of correlations and not causations, basically? And it's like, that's a simple thing. And it's sort of a bit of an overused phrase at this point, but basically, do you see those things and start to be able to piece together what might be happening with that? The easy example that people always say is like, that ice cream sales and drownings are correlated. Does one cause the other? It's like, no, it's both in hot weather. That's an obvious example, but the way that these things actually happen in practice is you'll see two things often move together, and you have to figure out, okay, what might be driving, like is A causing B, is B causing A, is C causing both of them? Are they totally unrelated and it's random? And so it's more about understanding kind of how to interpret data in that way, not necessarily about having like these formal sorts of skills. So they can help, but I think a lot of it comes from again, just this practice and just working through problems. You'll start to see things that are patterns in the way that these things behave. That if you're looking at these two data sets and they are two sort of metrics, they move in similar ways, there are questions you can start to ask yourself that help sort of unlock some of the additional, like what happens next. Like one of the questions I often ask is, okay, we're seeing this behavior. We're seeing behavior A, we think it's caused by B. If B is happening, what else would be happening? Like, what are the other implications of B happening that would prove that it was actually happening and for us to be able to do this? Or what are the implications that would show B couldn't be happening? And so there's lots of little things like that you can have. There are these kind of like mental tricks of sorts that allow you to say, okay, we're trying to do some sort of analysis. How do we sort of push that analysis forward? And you can find these places that are kind of, okay, let's try this, let's try this, let's try this. And eventually you'll start to build the habits around that's how you can answer those questions.
Gotcha. And just kind of also looking back at what we said up to now. So like the aspects that make a strong analyst. So one would be curiosity, working on something that you like. Another one would be sort of these qualitative metrics, as well as having the tenacity to learn these skills as you go along. So what other skills, what other personality traits do you believe really separate the average analyst from a great analyst?
There's a big part of it is also just interpersonal skills, basically, that I think there is the job of an analyst at a lot of companies is to be an advisor of sorts. You come in, there's a problem, there's a business problem people are trying to figure out. The analyst is there to support that problem and to figure out, hey, like, what do we do about this thing? So say you're trying to figure out, do we target the small segments or do we target like enterprise segments? And your sales team is trying to make a decision of where do they push their next campaigns. Is trying to target big companies or small companies. Those folks will often have some sort of intuition about what the right thing is. They're salespeople. They've been selling for a while. They kind of know what works. They may not have sort of all of the data that supports it. They may not have some scientific proof that this is the right thing for them to do, but they may have some intuition of like, well, we've been trying to sell these people. We've been struggling trying to sell these people. It's been working. Okay. When an analyst comes in to try to help with that problem, they can approach that as, well, here's the numbers person. We're coming in. We're going to tell you what the data says. We're going to tell you you're right or wrong. That no, it actually says we should be selling to the enterprise. I know your intuition says we should be selling to smaller companies, but data says enterprise. You're wrong. And there is, even in that, there is like a nice way to put that, and there's a way that alienates the folks that you're working with. There's a way that says, hey, like, this is what this says, let's work on it together. There's a way that says like, nope, you're right, I'm wrong, I'm the data person, I get this, I understand this better than you do. In some ways, I think even both of those are wrong. Like, your job as a data person is not to tell other people that they're wrong or to try to teach them what the numbers say. Your job is to understand their perspective and to try to like pull from them more information that helps like either confirm or dispute whatever the data is actually telling you as well. That I think there's often this kind of analogy that data people are consultants or something like that. I always think of them as better as being detectives, partly because that's what the job is shaped like, that you're actually trying to like solve these sort of problems. But part of it is that detectives don't show up at a crime scene and then tell all of the witnesses they're wrong. They don't tell them that like, actually the evidence looks like this, and the thing that you saw was not what you saw. Like, they try to understand what it is that the witnesses saw. They recognize they may not have seen things exactly as they actually thought they did, but their viewpoint is very valid. Their viewpoint actually enriches what it is you're trying to figure out. It isn't something to sort of prove or disprove. And so to me, that's the approach that analysts should be taking. Is you're there to try to solve the problem. All of the witnesses and the other people that are around are there to help provide more information. And collectively, you need to be able to figure out what ties all this together and explains this in a single story. Not, all right, I'm going to come in, tell you what my evidence says, tell you what the forensics say, and then just throw out everything that you see. Like that intuition is still very valuable. These people on the ground who are working on these problems are often going to have much sort of cleaner insight into something than you will as someone who's coming in from the outside.
And yeah, and that makes sense. Like an openness to others' opinions and empathy all really help to build your understanding of your qualitative reasoning. And actually, this is a great time to throw it to the people who are to our participants who are currently listening. So we're actually very interested to hear what you have to say with regard to the top qualities of what you look for, what you think make a great analyst. You can go ahead and put those in the chat as well. If you have any questions for Ben on his thoughts and views, you can go ahead and put it in the Q&A section as well. We want to make sure that this is a little bit of a back and forth so that we have a better understanding of where you're at, right? Because we're all in this together, we're all in the same industry, and we're all working toward understanding truth, which I think is our job, right? To understand truth. So while the audience is doing that, Ben, question for yourself. Now, this is a challenging one. One about culture and obstacles, right? So what type of cultural things, let's say as a young analyst coming into an organization, what types of cultural challenges are they going to encounter? And we'll leave it there for now. So yes, what type of cultural challenges do you think that someone coming in with a little bit of experience will encounter with their new profession?
Yeah, so there's a number of things I think that you could run into there. A lot of it depends on the culture of the team itself, and where kind of the data team is, or the team that you're a part of as part of the organization. So supposing you're coming into a team where the data team isn't well established, and the things that the data team is still trying to basically develop a voice within the organization. A lot of people are making decisions based on kind of what they believe or their intuition. And data is seen as a little bit more of an auxiliary function that is occasionally brought in. Sometimes people bring it in to basically bolster an argument that they want to make anyway, that they're saying, hey, we want to sell to the enterprise. Let's go get the data team to put together a report that tells us we should sell to the enterprise. In those cases, the obstacles you often encounter are more about trying to figure out like the voice of that team. That there's a lot of people who aren't going to be sure exactly what your role is. That data teams have, even the most successful ones, can have these kinds of nebulous roles where they're support organizations in some ways. They're not responsible for delivering a product or selling a product or marketing a product or anything like that. And so they often don't have like a sort of clear mandate in those cases, particularly when other people in the organization aren't using them in that way. So I think the obstacle that you run into there is figuring out like, what are you supposed to be doing? How do you actually help? I think there's some really good advice that I've said, and it slips my mind as to who actually said this. If I remember it, I'll let folks know. But basically, and it may have actually been from Bobby. I'm thinking of that same post about curiosity. Essentially, figure out what are the things that people seem to be making assumptions about, and like write them down and try to find the patterns in that where you can be supported. So say you're sitting in meetings and you're in a sales meeting and somebody says, yeah, well, we all know we need to be selling to the enterprise. And that sort of just is a thought that is spoken kind of out of hand, but is something that is clearly something that people have in their heads. Write that down and think like, hey, can I validate that? Can I test that and make sure that that's something that's right? The point isn't to prove them wrong. The point is that you're trying to understand like, what are the things that people in this organization are thinking? What are the places where they either have questions or they're making assumptions that you could try to enrich those views in some way? Maybe they're entirely right. It may be that they're not right. It may be that they should be selling to the enterprise, but only in a particular way. And people want that nuance. So part of that, I think, is trying to understand kind of what are the assumptions that people are making and figuring out from there. The other type of organization you can come into is one where that's much more established, where the data team has a clearer role. And in those cases, I think the challenge is more with the team. It's more, okay, you have people who probably have developed relationships with other people around the company. As a newer analyst, you're trying to figure out where do you fit into that? Like, how do you support these existing relationships? How do you support the ways that your data team is already serving the rest of the company? And in those cases, it's often kind of figuring out what it is that other people have done in those positions. It's figuring out the places that there are gaps, there are questions. There's always going to be more questions that a business doesn't know, and trying to find those sort of niches where you're not just piling on top of somebody else's work or trying to like critique some small thing is trying to find, oh, we actually don't really think about mobile analytics, for instance, or we're not thinking about how to measure the effectiveness of a webinar. If there are these places where these gaps, if you want to be able to insert yourself into those problems, people are always willing to try to understand something. If you go to a marketer and say, hey, we want to understand the effectiveness of webinars, then nobody's going to tell you no. They're going to say, like, great, I would love to see what you come up with. And so you can find those sort of holes in what it is a team does to try to figure out places where you can really kind of make a name for yourself within the organization.
And it sounds like, with culture, you divided up into two ideas. One, established teams. So you need to figure out how to support those existing relationships. And with new teams, it's a challenge because you have to create relationships and try to avoid conflict. So those are two very, very important ways to think about it. We have a question from the audience. I'll read it off. And if you could also respond to it, Ben. So the question is, what are some traditional KPIs that business analysts are evaluated on? And second question, what are the KPIs do you think they should be evaluated on?
So this is a good question. And I think this is actually a pretty big, sort of ironically, a big gap in the way that analytics teams are often, and sort of business analyst teams are often thought about, is there aren't really good KPIs for it, that most businesses don't really evaluate it. Some try to through the effectiveness of projects on the bottom line. So for instance, it may be that you're trying to evaluate, okay, we built a project to measure like like lead scoring, essentially. We want to understand, okay, we're rather than targeting leads randomly or targeting leads by intuition, we want to target like which leads are most valuable. Some teams may try to put like a dollar amount on that, of saying, okay, we used to do leads this way, now we're doing it this way. We brought in X more revenue because of that. Let's attribute that to the analyst. This analyst is good because they did this sort of thing. That, I think, is a fairly narrow view of what business analytics is supposed to be, what data science is supposed to be. Not everything that you do is going to have that immediate sort of path to a bottom line. If you're helping the business make a big strategic decision, you don't know what the difference is between, should we focus on this audience, or should we, build this big project initiative or this big product initiative. It's hard to conclude those sort of things. So a lot of times teams just don't get measured. And there was a conversation I saw a couple weeks ago where it was basically saying that the investment, on one hand, we as data people like to say everybody should be putting investments in data teams. It's great, like most executives underinvest in it. On the other hand, a lot of executives have to make that investment in faith. They make investment in the faith that, okay, I'm going to spend a bunch of money on some expensive people and technology. They're going to go buy a bunch of data tools. We're going to do some analysis. And then how are we going to decide whether or not it was worth it? Well, those same people might do some analysis to prove to me that they were worth it. And like, it's a sort of strange thing. So there's not really a great way to do it. A lot of teams basically don't. The thing that I think is, if there had to be a metric to measure it, my answer is essentially is like an NPS. It's does the rest of the organization feel that the data team is providing them value? That, like, do they recommend having somebody from the data team in the room when they're trying to solve problems? Because for the most part, those people, they may not be able to say like exactly why that is. They may not be able to tie it again to dollars and cents. But if marketers are saying we're trying to solve problems, we're trying to make decisions, we know kind of what our KPIs are, and we feel like this person on the data team, we're way better off with this person in there than we are without them, then to me, the data team is doing their job. That in the same way that a lot of products are, the KPI of the product can be things like usage, it can be all sorts of other things. But at the end of the day, what really matters is the people who use it say they want to keep using it, or are they upset if you take it away. That's kind of how a data team is if you're upset that you're taking it away, then you're probably doing something right. Maybe you're just great friends with these people, but probably not. Like, you probably want to work with these people. And if they're not upset that you're taking it away, or they're like fine that it's not there, then for the most part, people aren't going to be, that to me is a sign of a problem. The other thing is that also can check some of like the bedside banner type of piece of it, where even if you're doing something that's potentially valuable, if nobody wants to work with you, there's also a problem in that as well.
What a problem.
So if people love working with you, then you're doing your job, basically, is providing this great service and this great product to the rest of the organization.
So it's looking like you said the Net Promoter Score, which is detractors and promoters, and the percentage of that, and you get an idea of how well you're doing. One, in terms of how well people enjoy working with you, and two, just the quality of your work. So that I love that. I'm a big fan of Net Promoter Scores in all aspects of what I do.
and like it's sort of the Net Promoter Scores in spirit. I don't know that, it's not necessarily exactly, would you recommend this analyst to your friends?
In spirit, yes, in spirit,
that sort of thing is, I think, as good of a check as you can have if you're looking for like one KPI for a data team.
Awesome. Okay, next question is from an anonymous attendee. What is the best way for more senior analysts to support their junior team members?
So give them hard problems.
Why?
Like,
that's interesting.
Because I think, one, that's motivating for most people. There will be some people who sort of want to be handheld and things like that. But for most people, it's motivating to work on hard things. It's motivating to work on things that have a lot of visibility. When I first was getting started, I had a boss who I think supported me really well. One of the things that he did was he gave me hard problems with a lot of visibility that had relatively low downside. That would be things that's not like, okay, if we mess this up, like this whole company is going under. It was stuff that there was a way for, like, sure, I could do it badly and it would be like a little bit of egg on my face, maybe a little bit of egg on his face. But for the most part, like, things would just keep on going. And I think there's a tendency to give people kind of like simple, slow ramp. Here's kind of a small toy problem. This person's asking a question that doesn't mean anything. Nobody wants to do it. Give it to the junior person as a way to learn. Okay, like that will work. Eventually people will probably learn, but I think it's much faster to get people up to speed and for them to kind of learn the impact that they can have, to be excited about the job. If you're given a problem where it's like, hey, the CEO is giving a presentation at a big conference next month. They need these various numbers pulled for it so they can put these tips on a slide. Go work with the CEO on that thing. And like, there is some trust that goes with that. But I think that's the thing that gets people really excited. It gets people to where they want to work on the things. They feel excited about the problems. They'll push themselves harder to learn it. They will ask other people for help when they need it because they know their job is, they know it's relatively important. It's not something that they can just be like, well, nobody cares about this. I can just do it in the corner on my own. And if it goes wrong, like, okay, it goes wrong. It's not that big of a deal. If you put some number on a slide, like, chances are somebody will catch that anyway, but if it doesn't, okay, the companies will probably be fine. And I think those sorts of things of like finding places where people can have a real impact, but it isn't something that it feels important, even though it's relatively low risk, I think is a much better place to start than like, okay, here are some toy problems, sort of slowly unfold them to bigger stuff over time. It also helps like push people. People are often better at this than you may initially think. You may be nervous about it. And it's like, give them the chance to succeed rather than protecting them from the chance to fail.
Awesome. Hey, it's a good idea. And also I realize right now that we have people's schedules potentially coming up with some hard stops. So I did want to ask just one or two final questions and then round things out. But if you importantly would like to be reached out to by someone from the Mode team, you can go ahead and email us, and this is certainly something that we can discuss further, either with one of our salespersons or if you'd like to learn more about Mode. So just two final questions, and then we will conclude the presentation. And this one is again from someone who is just starting. It's a very personal question for this particular individual, and I'd like to get your take. So I'll read the question. I have just been made part of a part-time analyst in a small 20-year-old company. In my full time, I do customer support. The org does not have a track record of data-driven approaches. So knowing where to even start across the various departments is quite tough and ambiguous. Any ideas on some questions to start thinking about?
Yeah. So one, I think it's cool to take that initiative. I think that's how a lot of people actually get into this, is they start in other roles and becomes the data person, become the person who starts to dabble in it. And then suddenly a lot of people start going to them because they say, oh, this person knows this. I have questions, I'll ask them. That I think can often be ways that people transition into data roles. So it's cool to do that. I think in terms of questions to be asking, so if you're working in a customer support role, it's allowing yourself to be pulled by the questions that you have, rather than thinking about, okay, what does the business need? What is the CEO thinking? What are the business stakeholders thinking? A big part of it can be just, what am I thinking? What do I wonder? What would be something that I know would make my job better? Because chances are, if it make your job better, then there's other people who might be interested in that. The other thing, the kind of opposite approach to that is the thing I mentioned earlier about like listening in on meetings on where people are making assumptions, what it is that people are wondering. There will be tons of meetings you'll be in where somebody will be like, oh, I wonder if we get more support tickets at this time or this time, or I wonder if we get more support tickets on customers that are new versus ones that have been around a while. That people will say as kind of these offhand remarks, that if you start to like pull those things together and kind of collect those various questions, you don't need to answer every one of them or anything like that, but you can kind of start to see where it is that people are like, what is it they're wondering? What are the things that might be valuable? And then once you start to have those things, if you're able to answer them, just being able to say, hey, like I have some facts for you. Like people are asking these things. I put together this presentation on just some like facts about our support organization or facts about the way this part of the business works. Nobody's going to turn that down. Nobody doesn't want to go to or look at the slide deck that's a series of charts that's explaining something about the business. That's always something people are going to be interested in. And so I think it's useful to know that your work is something that will have sort of an intrinsic draw. It's something that people will want to see. And so the only question is like, all right, how do I find the questions that might sort of lead to more questions and get people to draw in even more? And I think the easiest way to do that is either what are the things that you yourself are curious about, or if like you have a very sort of singular role or something like that, it's what are the things that other people are kind of wondering aloud? And there will be, once you start to notice that, there are tons of places where people will do these sorts of things. Or again, they'll make assumptions about stuff where everybody knows this, or we know we can't do that because, or whatever. And if those things don't have any kind of data behind them, then you can go out and say like, I wanted to try to understand that better and figure out whether or not that's true or not, or what nuance there might be actually to it.
Awesome. And our last question for today. And before we conclude with the last question, I wanted to thank everyone on this call and all of the attendees. We had a very, very good turnout. So thank you very, very much. We definitely appreciate your support. And if you have any questions for us, again, please reach out. This is an ongoing conversation, and we'd love to continue it with each and every one of you. And as well, I want to apologize for the last two questions. Unfortunately, I again want to just make sure we respect everyone's time to make sure that everyone can meet their next appointment at the next hour, wherever they're at. So, final question. I often see job requirements for a data analyst that have a feature creep into data science qualifications. What's your take on this?
I think it's happening. I think that's certainly there. There will be new tools, new libraries, new things that become in vogue that it's easy to pile into a job rec where it's like, oh, we all now use this tool. We want to put skills in this thing here. We all, 20 years ago, Tableau was not on any resumes. Now it's on a lot of them. There are more things like that. Obviously, that will get thrown in. There are Jupyter library or Python libraries that will get thrown in. There's experience with Jupyter or RStudio that people add now. And sort of as those things proliferate, as the data space gets bigger and bigger, which is like expanding pretty quickly at this point, a lot of people might put in those sorts of things. They're also, because data science roles in particular have kind of an engineering bent, there's also a lot of like feature creep towards technical skills of, do you know how to use Docker, or do you know how to use Kubernetes, or do you know how to use like Git or whatever else, like these various sort of engineering type of tools. I think it's kind of a problem for the space. I understand why it's there. Again, I think it's largely there because there's a lot of people who apply for these jobs. It's an easy thing to filter on. It weeds people out. I think it's a problem for the space because it weeds the wrong people out. It weeds out people who might be great analysts who just haven't learned the technical skills, or people who are coming from backgrounds that might be, as you said, they may be social scientists. They may be folks who are historians that are really good analytical thinkers, but just haven't gotten exposure to those technologies. So I think it's something that, like, as there is no sort of fix to that, no obvious fix to that. I think as if you are an employer, you're looking to hire people, and this is what we do at Mode, we very much try to limit the sorts of things we put in job recs to say, hey, we need these skills, unless they truly are like actual requirements. So for instance, there's folks on our engineering team that need to solve certain problems that we don't want to teach them Go, for instance. Okay, we don't want someone to come in who's never touched Go, but even in that case, if they've learned, they Java experts, they could probably learn it relatively quickly. So we want to sort of express some of that in some ways. So what we try to do is explain, like, what are the problems you're going to solve? These are the things we're going to be asking you to do, and then be a little more generous with when you're doing the resume screens. It takes a little bit longer if you're not throwing people out who don't have certain lines listed on it. That's okay. That's what it takes to build a really good team. Like, building a really good team is worth the effort. And so some of it is just like the solution to it is we got to do some of the work. But I think that's what makes it, it is worth it in the end if you find the right people to do that. So yeah, so I think it's certainly true that there is some kind of like feature creep in this. We collectively, I think, have some responsibility to try not to let that happen. But yeah, I think that's a sort of unfortunate trend of the industry. And I think it'll eventually probably correct itself, but right now that's a little bit where we are.
Awesome. And thank you very much for that explanation. So it looks like we are at time. So thank you very much, Ben, for your views and insights. And also I want to thank everyone on this call, all the participants, as well as support staff, for running this webinar. We could not have done it without you. And again, importantly, this is not the end of this conversation. If you would like to talk more about this, or more importantly, get in contact with Mode, please go ahead and do that at hi@modeanalytics.com. We would absolutely love to hear from you. And with that, have a good day. And Ben?
James, thanks so much.
Awesome. And have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. Bye.